Okay. We got a recording is now in progress. Well, I was just going to say, for the folks who are new to us, we Dismantling Racism Together is a loose-knit group of people. We're not incorporated. We're not a nonprofit. We're just a group of people who come together on a monthly basis to study racism. And this started after George Floyd's untimely death. And we've been educating ourselves regularly. And our focus over the past several years that we've been doing this has been racism as we know it in the United States, having to do with Black. We're very fortunate tonight to expand our horizons and our understandings with John being with us. And with that, I'm going to ask Karen Watson if you'll do the honors to introduce John to us.
Yes, thank you, George. Yes, it really is an honor for me to introduce John Suzukida to all of you. Rick and I have known John and his wife for about 3.5 years now. We met each other through mutual friends, and we struck it up so well. We're planning our 3rd trip together in January. We've been traveling together some, and we always have enjoyed John's company so much, and he's just one of the dearest, best persons I know. Thoughtful, very thoughtful, and we've had lots of wonderful discussions. Through COVID, we were carrying on Zoom meetings rather frequently, the 6 of us, John and his wife Lori and the other couple. And anyway, he's just a very dear friend. He lives in Minnesota, so he's been down to West Virginia once, I think, and maybe has another trip planned pretty soon. But John's a very devoted family person. He now has 6 or 7 grandkids, or another one on the way. John,
yeah, 5.95. We've got one due on September 1st. So
okay. Okay, yeah, I was a little afraid we might not be able to, we might have to cancel John's presentation if the other baby came. Anyway, we've known John for 3 years through COVID and all, and I think that our Tucker County group, Rick and I helped along with some other people to Maria Thacker is on, Maria and Bob Thacker. We were all very active also, like the Morgantown group. After the George Floyd incident, we came together and did the same kind of thing that you folks have been doing, but it did eventually, we started losing attendance, and so we're not active now in Tucker County. But so I was so happy to discover your group a few months ago through Susan, and she happened to mention that you were thinking of branching out a little bit or trying to address all forms of discrimination. And I believe you were talking about Asian discrimination, Asian American discrimination at that point. And I said, well, I happen to know someone who has a wonderful PowerPoint presentation. And John gave that to our Tucker County group. And I think all of you will find it very powerful. He shares his family's story in their own words. And I think we'll all be very moved to tears as well as inspired. And hopefully we can have a nice discussion maybe afterwards as to, how we might deal with, avoid the same kind of thing in the future. So with that, John, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Karen. And I'd have to say personally that it's really an honor to meet with a group of people that are meeting for this reason. And so I'm very happy to go through and also address anything. George, to your point, if anybody has something, just don't wait. Feel free to interrupt. a good portion of my professional career was giving presentations. And so I've given this one to just under 2,000 people. And so it's not like I would get thrown off. I'd rather have somebody ask a question or make a comment about something specifically right then than wait. And so feel free to interrupt. And if I don't see you on the screen because it's going to be shrunk down, as George, I think you implied, just say something, and I'd be happy to stop and move on. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen again and make sure I pick the right one here. Okay. Now you should all have it up. I'm going to minimize there and put it in. Okay. Does everybody have the full screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'll go ahead and kick it off. I have been a member of Rotary International for probably 15 or 16 years now. And if anyone of you are familiar with Rotary, typically clubs have a speaker a week. And so over that time, you see a lot of different speakers and different topics. And I'd like to kind of cut to the chase and just kind of set expectations for what it is and what it isn't, having sat through quite a few different talks. Hopefully, by going through this, it will help us all avoid repeating mistakes that we've made in our past. I've learned over time, talking to many people, that it's discussing a topic that's just not always taught in school. There's some people who have heard of it and didn't know anything about it, others who haven't heard anything of it. And it varies by region and by school. Clearly, this is a thoughtful audience to be meeting on this topic, and so hopefully it will leave you with maybe a different perspective. It's very much a personal, historic experience from my parents' documents. I've gone through those. One of the things about Rotary, in my club anyway, is that when you're the incoming president, you need to set up speakers for the year. And so as I was doing that, it's invariably somebody has a conflict and doesn't show up. Sometimes you don't know until they are not there. And so I thought I better have a couple talks in my back pocket just in case. And this turned out to be one of them. I thought, well, I'll put it together. It was after I kind of pulled together some material from my mother that she had put together. So it's very much pulled together from her time and effort to do that. So that's what it is. What it isn't is I'm not by any stretch an expert on this topic. I'm also not a historian, and it's not a political commentary. That's just specifically not. It's really a personal story. So that's what it is and what it isn't. And clearly, those are my folks back. I actually don't know exactly when that picture was taken, but I believe it was based on what I'm recollecting in the early 1950s. So just by way of background, so you know where I'm coming from, I was born and raised in Skokie, Illinois, which is a north suburb of Chicago. And I am going to circle back to that towards the end of the talk. Skokie has kind of an interesting significance. By education, I'm a mechanical engineer, but I really didn't spend a whole lot of time in engineering. I ended up doing technical marketing and executive management in a company called Train. And then for the past 21 years, I've been doing consulting on my own, and I've been a member of several different boards, both profit as well as nonprofit boards. We were moved to Minnesota in 1992, and I live just north of Minneapolis, St. Paul. We have 3 adult kids, and as I was kind of kidding before, 5.96 grandchildren. I actually did the math. It's probably the engineer in me, but we're several days away from the due date of our grandson, who will be our 6th grandchild. So we're really looking forward to that. So that's where I'm coming from. What I'm going to do is just jump right into the topic. And so, of course, the day of infamy, December 7th, 1941, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, within 4 days, the West Coast was declared a theater of war. In February, so not long after, 2 months later, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, and the significance of that is it allowed the military to exclude any person from anywhere without due process. And so I think we've all become more familiar with executive orders, and many of you, I'm sure, know quite a bit more about them than I do, but it's become a tool used more commonly. But it was used then to sign this decree. The significance of that is 6 days after it was issued, the Navy informed Japanese American residents of Terminal Island, which is near the LA harbor, that they must leave in 48 hours. And that's where my mom lived with her family. When you look at the geography of California, it's that part kind of swings east and then goes back down south. And so the beaches actually face south at that point, and that's where Terminal Island is. It's interesting. Spin is something that we see quite a bit of today, but it's always been around. And this is kind of an interesting spin. Toward the end of 1942, President Roosevelt labeled what really are technically concentration camps, relocation centers. And 120,000 alien and non-alien residents of Japanese ancestry were relocated to those 10 concentration camps. 2/3 of those were U.S. citizens. Now, in the context of citizenship, we're all familiar with the term alien, obviously a non-citizen. And so to use a double negative, a non-alien is clearly a citizen, but you wouldn't want to put on the posters, one of which I'll show you in just a few moments. You wouldn't want to put there, you're putting U.S. citizens in concentration camps. And so the spin on that was the alien and non-alien, and being put not in concentration camps, but in relocation centers. I'll also come back to the 2/3 being U.S. citizens as I go through this. Now, I don't speak Japanese. Being third generation, I grew up in north of Chicago. Quite frankly, I struggled taking the second language of French. But that's really the only language I know some of. So a lot of people are kind of surprised that I don't know any, but I'm going to teach you 2 Japanese words because it's relevant to this. In fact, one of the ironies is a company that I've ended up consulting for a long time is out of Japan, and they were very puzzled by me because I, as they characterize, I look so Japanese. And so they finally concluded and observed that I have Japanese hardware with American software. And I think that kind of is a pretty good summary. So the 2 words, the first word that I'm going to teach you is Issei, and that's the first generation immigrants. And by law, they were all denied U.S. citizen because of being Japanese. Second word is Nisei, and that's the second generation who clearly were born in the U.S. So my grandparents were Issei, and they arrived in the U.S. between the years 1899 and 1914. Driven by economic reasons and economic opportunity, similar to, of course, many of our immigrants historically. And my parents were then Nisei, being born in the U.S. It was both the Nisei and the Issei that were incarcerated in America's concentration camps. The 1/3, 2/3 that I mentioned before, roughly 2/3 were Nisei and 1/3 were Issei, the first generation. So to the extent that there is such a thing, my parents had kind of an all-American childhood back in the 1920s and 30s. My dad actually lived in Hollywood and went to a high school in Hollywood named John Marshall High School. And there were 3 schools that were used as background, or, as the Grease, basically, the movie Grease was filmed in. And John Marshall High School was one of them. My dad actually wrote the school song for John Marshall High School. He led various clubs and sang in the Glee Club. So that was his background briefly. And my mom, her dad was a big baseball fan. And he brought my mom to Chicago Cub games in the spring training games in the 1920s in Los Angeles's Wrigley Field. Some of you may be familiar with that. Catalina Island outside of Los Angeles, where P.K. Wrigley put Wrigley Field West and built a hotel next to it so he could watch what was going on in spring training. So my mom remained a lifelong Cub fan, and she passed away in late 2014 at the age of 94, or 2015 at the age of 94, and missed by 1 year the Cubs finally winning the World Series after all the years that she watched them. I remember as a kid listening to WGN radio, or watching them on TV, and so I was also afflicted with the same Cub fan-itis. You know, I'm sure we're all guilty of this to various degrees. Your parents say some things when you're young and it kind of goes in 1 ear and right out the other. And my dad had always said he sang the school song, but when I was going through their papers, after both of them had passed, I found this, and it was a school song. And down at the bottom there, you can see my dad wrote the words. Back in those days, they graduated winter and I guess it'd be summer, winter or spring, whatever the second season is they considered graduation. But he was winter of the class of 1938 from John Marshall High School. So with that, which is kind of to give a context and background for where I'm coming from, a little bit about my family, I'm going to switch from that narrative into using some of the information and words that my mom put together based on her input and my dad's input while they were alive, who took this on as a retirement project and wrote a book, a kind of a family book that gave historical context to some of the personal observations and sharing. So I'm going to shift first to some of my dad's words, and I'll mix those in with my mom's words as we go. Following the outbreak of hostilities between Japan and America, the plate glass window of the family restaurant was smashed several times. They owned a small family restaurant in Los Angeles. After the window was broken the second time, the insurance company canceled our policy. On December 10th, someone posted a sign on our door that read, "Open season on Japs. This is a Jap joint. We are at war with Japan." Surprisingly, the restaurant became busier than ever. Old customers from far away flocked in to reassure us that they considered us loyal Americans and would continue to patronize our cafe. However, the federal government froze our bank accounts. The state of California revoked our beer and wine licenses and took away our sales tax permit, which meant we could no longer conduct a business in the state. Knowing that we were moving, we made preparations to sell the restaurant. A buyer was found and the final transaction was made after we entered Santa Anita. I'll come back to that in just a moment, but Santa Anita, it was and is still a horse racing facility. Frank, my dad's brother, received a mere fraction of the restaurant's actual worth. Mama sold a piano for $5. I sold my Ford for $25. My brother-in-law sold his international truck for $45. Each family was assigned a family number. Ours was number 18257. Each of us was allowed to take only 2 bags. So amongst the things that my parents kept is this bag, and this is a picture of the front and the back of it. Barry is one of my dad's other brothers, and you can see the number 18257, and the camp destination they're headed to was Granada, Colorado. And so when I give this talk in person, I bring the bag along. I should measure it, but it's not huge, but basically it's like a big laundry sack, and they were able to basically take what they could carry, or 2 of those, and that's all they had. Continuing with my dad's words, on May 1, 1942, members of my family were interned at the Santa Anita racetrack, which had been renamed the Santa Anita Assembly Center. Altogether, there were about 18,000 men, women, and children of Japanese ancestry placed there under protective custody. About 2/3 of those herded into camp were U.S. citizens, and the balance were those of my parents' generation, who had come from Japan but were not citizens because the Asian exclusion law prohibited that. They were also prohibited from owning land in their name. Now, it's interesting because I did have a chance to see Santa Anita back in the late 70s when we were in California, and along with one of my sisters and my brother, and we went to see it, and he was pointing out various things there and in the stands to help keep up morale. He was a good singer. That trait did not get passed down to me, but he was a good singer and he loved leading groups in song. And so he'd have people just all over in the bleachers, and he'd be down there leading them in songs just to kind of keep up morale. And he pointed out those stands. It was a weekday, so the stadium or the racetrack was closed. So we couldn't get in to see it, but it's quite a memory for me to have him describing Santa Anita and how it was used. So continuing with those words and in the context of Santa Anita, he said, "How were the stalls where they kept the horses used? The evacuees lived in them, and the odor of horses remained even though the evacuees tried to sanitize them. There were barbed wires all along the fences surrounding the Santa Anita Assembly Center. We were under surveillance of armed soldiers from atop watchtowers. We really couldn't believe it because we'd not done anything wrong. There was a bed count every morning and night by persons we called woodpeckers, because they knocked on the wooden barrack doors to check up on our presence." I'm going to switch from my dad's words to my mom's at that same time. Her family lived with her family, and my dad lived with his family. They had met before the war, but only once, and they were not a couple. They ended up re-meeting again in Chicago, but at this point they were not a couple, and so they each went with their own families. So her family was sent to Poston, Arizona. So my mom's words: "Furnishings worth from $50 to $200 went for $4 or $5. Strangers with trucks were waiting until the Japanese moved out. They hauled away whatever they wanted. Relatives, friends, and persons from other groups, like the Quakers, came to help. However, jobbers, opportunists, used furniture dealers all came in droves like vultures. I remember that we sold a large safe that was in the store. They owned a dry goods store, for $5, and before it was moved, the buyer sold it for a much higher price to someone else. So they flipped it right there." Prior to our sudden departure from Terminal Island, living with armed guards present at all times, with unannounced raids by officials, our lives were in constant turmoil. All public gatherings were banned except for religious services. Now, as I'm sure we've all experienced, sometimes at the worst of times, the brightest parts of human nature seem to come out. I mentioned before with my dad's family restaurant, how old customers came in from far away to support them. A similar type of story happened with my mom's parents' dry goods store. Dry goods sold things like bolts of cloth and those types of things. And my grandfather evidently was a kind of a natural business person. And so when a young Levi Strauss salesman first started, and he was on, my grandfather's store was on his route, he kind of taught him the ropes about the business and how things worked. And that Levi Strauss salesman, my grandfather passed away a couple years before the war broke out. So when he passed away, that salesman came in to help my grandmother get things figured out and sorted out so that she could continue to run the store. And then when all of this happened, he came, and if you can picture the scenario of people selling things almost like a garage sale, right? To move it along to any price, and if they didn't sell it, then people came and took it. And in that environment, this Levi Strauss salesman came back and bought everything he had sold to the store at the price that they had bought it for. And so it's a fascinating side of human nature for the bright spots to come out sometimes in the worst of times. I mentioned before that I'd point to a poster, as some of you may know, back in those days, they would put these posters around telephone poles and thumbtack them in, and that was basically the way information was shared. And this is one of the posters that was up that my parents shared. And basically it just says, here's where you need to go, what you can bring, and when, all the rules about what you needed to do as part of the evacuation. I'm going to continue with some of my mom's words. Dr. John W. Thomas, Secretary for the Department of Cities for the American Baptist Home Mission Society, came from the New York headquarters to see what was happening to the Japanese Americans when the possibility of evacuation was discussed. He became a frequent visitor to Poston. Again, that's the camp that they were assigned to. He learned that my education had been delayed because of father's death. A few months later, he asked if I'd like to finish my college education. She had started in a couple of years at college and obviously got interrupted. Because the church had stood by us during both of our upheavals, I chose to go into Christian work. As I searched for schools, I discovered that the Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary, just outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, offered a Bachelor of Religious Education. I applied and was accepted. I was seated in the back of an Army truck with open sides leaving Poston for the Parker, Arizona train station on October 10th, 1942. The WRA, the War Relocation Authority, paid the train fare and provided $25 spending money. I arrived October 12th, 1942, a full month after classes had begun in September. My mother was met by the Dean of Women for the Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and they kind of had a natural chemistry. They kind of hit it off, and that woman, Irene Jones, never married, and so she kind of became a grandparent. Visit us whenever she came through town, which was fairly frequently, since the American Baptist had an assembly center in south part of Wisconsin. And so when she came through to that, she would invariably fly into O'Hare and stay with us a little while and then go up to the meetings. And so they continued a lifelong relationship and friendship. So many of us, watched, of course, movies, war movies, and you always think about going, especially in Europe, going from country to country. You think about people had to have their papers. One of the things that my parents kept, and I scanned it in and then put the original in a safe for safekeeping, was this letterhead that is on the letterhead of the Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary and signed by a member of the military. And basically this was what my mother had to carry as at that point in time, she would have been a 21-year-old college student going from Arizona to Philadelphia. And she had to carry these to help her safe and unquestioned passage. Again, as a U.S. citizen, it's just hard, it's unimaginable to think that in the U.S. that someone would need to carry, especially a citizen, would need to carry papers like this just to go to college. On the right here is a picture of my mom at that time, the visual of her climbing in the back of an Army pickup truck, basically, to take the ride to the train station. This is about the age that she was, and pictured here with her brother, who became a United Church of Christ minister as well. My mom ended up spending the rest of her life in her working time, working for different church organizations because of her original commitment due to the involvement of church communities. So I'm going to move from that to some more historical context, and then I'll come back to wrap up kind of the personal story side of it. This is a picture of one of the concentration camps when my kids were younger, back in, it was almost 30 years ago, 28, 29 years ago. The Smithsonian in DC had a great display of the internment camps. And so I wanted my kids, my 3 kids, to see it with my mom. And so we traveled out there and saw it. And her impressions were that they did a great job and it was very realistic. One of the things that she described is because so many of these were in the desert, theirs was in the desert. Of course, desert's very hot during the day, but also can be very cold at night, and the wind and the sand is blowing. And so one of the things that she described is those boards that were, slapped together, of course, weren't designed to keep sand out. And so she said there was always sand everywhere. And when you take a look at these barracks that were set up, they were designed so that 4 different families would be in one barrack. And then various ones were set up as the latrines. And so they were set up with basically just a row of stools, one after the other, all the way down, and no privacy. There was nothing between each of the stools. And so you can imagine if all you have is what you can carry, there's not a preponderance of sheets or things that you could hang up. And so for a long time, she said one of the difficult parts mentally was just the loss of humanness that you have under those kind of conditions. So I'm going to shift, as I said, to the more kind of a historical context. During the war, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Battalion was put together, is made up of all Japanese American. The genesis of that started in Hawaii, which has a very large population, of course, of people who immigrated from Japan. And this is prior, of course, to Hawaii being a state. But that was the beginning of it. And as time went on, recruiters from the U.S. military actually went into the concentration camps to recruit mainland Americans of Japanese descent. Of course, at that age range, all of them were second generation, looking for late teenagers and early 20s to join. And join they did. So this 442nd was involved in a rescue of what was called the Lost Battalion. And it was a unit of the Texas 36th Infantry Division that was in France's Vosges Mountains. The words that are used to describe what was happening to that Texas unit is that they were cut off in the mountain and they were being chewed up. And so various groups have been sent in with no success to get them out. And they finally sent the 442nd in, and they succeeded in getting them out, incurring 800 casualties, rescuing the 211 people over a period of 6 days. There is a movie that was made in the 50s about that rescue, which is incredibly progressive, especially for considering at the time, only 10 years or so after the war, really capturing many of the key elements. And recently, in the past 3 years, the author of Boys in the Boat, Daniel Brown, if any of you have read that, about the 1936 Olympics and the rowing team from Washington that went on in the Olympics. That author wrote a book about this account, that he went and interviewed survivors of the 442nd to get their firsthand accounts. And it's an outstanding book. It's gruesome because it goes into great and accurate detail of what happened and what they did. But that was an interesting group for many reasons, not the least of which because they were in large part recruited from the concentration camps. My parents both reflected that at the time that they were sent to camp, that they figured it was for life. I mean, what else could you think when you were told to sell everything, take what you could carry, and you're shipped on a train to wherever, one of 10 different facilities. And then there's guard towers and stories of people who got too close to a guard tower. There's an older man walking his dog who got too close to the fence and got shot. There's various things like that happened. And so their observation and conclusion was, this is where we live now. And they made the best of it. Those who farmed tried to raise crops, of course, not easy to do in the desert. Those who led Boy Scout troops or Girl Scout troops did that. those who taught, but they just tried to make the best of it. So to come in and recruit people is kind of an audacious initiative that had actually some great results. This 442nd became the most decorated unit in American history. And when you consider that 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent were put in the concentration camps, 23,000 Nisei, again, the second generation American-born U.S. citizens served in the U.S. military, receiving all sorts of, you can see on the screen how many decorations they received. But in addition, yes.
What's the name of that book?
In fact, my wife is reading it right now. I'm horrible on names. I can send it.
Mavis, I just looked it up. It's called Facing the Mountain,
Thank you.
a true story of Japanese American heroes in World War II.
It's not a quick nor easy read, but it's a very accurate and well-researched. Again, if anyone saw or read The Boys in the Boat, incredibly well-researched. Daniel Brown really put years into it. So thank you for that, for the name. In addition to the 23,000 who served in the military, 6,000 served in the Army intelligence. And they were credited by General MacArthur's intelligence chief, who was General Charles Willoughby, with shortening the war by 2 years and saving uncountable numbers of lives. You know, it's interesting for me. I grew up, I heard these stories every now and then, and you tuck away some of them. And then I've gone through my material that my mom has put together, read some things along those lines to put together this story. Then talking to one of my cousin's wives out in California, who her family came from Hawaii, and she kind of chuckled about the reason why they didn't put residents, it was a territory, U.S. territory at that time. The reason they didn't put them in concentration camps is because people of a Japanese descent were the majority. So she was thinking, where would you put them? And so the people in Hawaii, Japanese Americans, did not go through the same type of thing that those on the West Coast and throughout different parts of the country, the mainland, went through. But her father was in the 442nd. And I had an opportunity to go to his service when he passed away, and she sent me a picture of this. You can see at the top, it's a memorial saying "Go for Broke." That was the motto of the people in the 442nd and 100th Battalion, because if you go in thinking that you're in jail for life, and then you have an opportunity to go out and serve in the military to prove that you're a loyal citizen, that was their motto, was go for broke. What did you have to lose, really? Some of them, that was it. And so on this memorial, you can see in the lower right-hand corner, it got a little cut out here. One of these days I should go out to LA and get a picture that shows this, but Major Charles Willoughby, who again was MacArthur's intelligence specialist, you can see the quote up there. It said, "The Nisei saved countless lives and shortened the war by 2 years." So interesting to have all that material and then have her send this picture containing the same thought processes. Now, living where I live in Minnesota, the need for people to interpret and help military intelligence figure out what was going on in Japan, the need was great. And so as they started looking for people to serve in the military intelligence service, they first housed them at the Presidio in San Francisco, and found, of course, as you're starting to put, for the most part, males, but young Japanese American males in that location during that time, it wasn't well received. And so knowing that they were going to be adding quite a few more, they started looking for where in the country would make sense. And living here in Minnesota. I'm proud to say that Savage, Minnesota is kind of it's not exactly a suburb, but it's a town southwest of Minneapolis. And it was chosen as one of the most receptive areas that this could be located. And so they moved it here. They moved the military intelligence school to Savage. And this is just a Minnesota highway marker, Camp Savage. And as it grew, they outgrew basically the facilities and ended up moving to Fort Snelling, which if you've ever flown into Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport, Fort Snelling is right there. So I won't read through this to you, but basically what it describes is the work that was done with the again Americans of Japanese descent. There's a lot of ironies, of course, that happen in any war, but one of them is of the 6,000 that served in the MIS, less than 10% spoke or understood any Japanese. So they kind of fall in my category, and they were assimilating. They didn't really keep the native language. So just one of the ironies there is that they were incarcerated due to the fear that they were communicating with Japan, and yet they never found one incident at all that ever happened. And so they spent time in Camp Savage and in Fort Snelling learning basically in a cram basis, learning the Japanese language in order to enable the members of the MIS to be effective. And so they would help interrogate captured soldiers, and they would help with the interpretation of documents and that sort of thing. But they went in from a cold start with only a couple percent of the total of them knowing fluent Japanese. The rest knew a little bit to none. It's just one of the ironies. There's an interesting questionnaire that residents needed to answer. And two questions in particular caused a lot of unrest, a lot of concern, to say the least. Question number 27 asked if the Nisei men, again, U.S. born, second generation, were willing to serve on combat duty whenever ordered or wherever ordered. Now, this is just asking people who have just been incarcerated into these camps if you'd be willing to serve. So if you say yes, does that mean you're volunteering? And this is kind of like standardized tests where there's no opportunity to ask the question or clarification. You just had to answer yes or no. So that caused a lot of consternation. The next question was also highly controversial. It asked if individuals would swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear any form of allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. Well, especially if you were born in the U.S., if you never held a loyalty to the Emperor, how can you forswear allegiance? And for those that were immigrants, first generation, the Issei, they were barred by law, U.S. law, from becoming U.S. citizens. Again, Asian exclusion law. And so if you renounce your citizenship of Japan, basically it left them with no country. And so you can see how both of these questions were highly controversial. And if you got a no in either one of those, you were sent to one camp in particular, Tule Lake. So my parents' post-war experiences. My mom ended up graduating with a Bachelor of Divinity degree. And as I mentioned before, she spent her life working concertedly, working in only church-related activities. My dad, if you can picture being 25, getting out of a camp in 1945 and being an American and Japanese descent, he ended up going to Chicago because a couple of his brothers did. So he went there and basically was having a hard time finding a job, of course. The Lincoln National Life Insurance Company in Chicago hired him, and he ended up being very loyal and staying there the rest of his working career. They, my mom and dad, very concertedly chose a non-Japanese American community. They decided that assimilation would be the right way for, there were 5 of us, 5 kids, to be raised. And so that's what we did. before I ended up doing consulting work for a Japanese company, I literally had probably met a dozen Japanese people in my life. I just never did, outside of my direct family. And so it was very curious. In one of these talks that I gave, somebody asked me a question. I don't remember exactly what the question was, but the way it was phrased was, how did my people feel about something? And I thought that was kind of curious to me, because I don't know. I don't know who are my people. It's when you grow up completely, it'd be like asking someone of Irish descent, what your people thought about that. And you think, I don't know, they're Americans, right? So just kind of interesting, but that's the cost as well as the advantage of being assimilated. They lived on the south side of Chicago, and as time went on, they had my first three girls that were born, my three older sisters were born, and there was a lot of concern amongst the teachers for where things were going, and they thought that they should consider moving, and they started taking a look at different places to go. And you like to think this doesn't happen anymore, but I think it might be naive to believe it doesn't. My dad would call places, and he'd look in the Chicago Tribune and look for different home sales, and he'd call and they'd say, yeah, come on out, take a look. He'd talk it over, and he'd go out there, and invariably when he got there, the response would be, that it just sold since we talked. And that happened many times. And one time when he saw this home for sale in Skokie, he had just recovered from the flu, or recovering from the flu, still feeling a little bit weak. And he called the realtor and talked about it. And he said, yeah, come on out. And he said, I'm just recovering from the flu. I'm kind of weak. I just want to say that I'm an American of Japanese descent. And if that makes a difference, I understand. I just want to know ahead of time. And the realtor responded with something that I'm not comfortable saying exactly what he said. So I'm going to ask you to use a little literal street interpretation of what I'm about to say. But the realtor basically said that he was of Italian descent, and the builder was of Polish descent. And he didn't really care what he was. He didn't care what my dad was. If he was interested in looking at the house, come look at the house. And so he did, and he bought it, and that's where I was born and raised. The insurance company that he worked for, one of his co-workers lived in Skokie. And I don't know, some of you may be aware of this, but Skokie, especially at that time in the 50s and 60s, was a unique place in the world. It was roughly half Jewish and the other half was German in the 50s. And so the home that my parents bought was in the Jewish area. And so when this co-worker of my dad's, who was Jewish, learned of that, he told my father, Henry, if you run into any problems, let me know. And that conversation never needed to happen. So from my perspective, growing up as a minority within a minority, especially in that era, is an interesting perspective. Just one of which is probably most memorable. One of my friends, in fact, my den mothers in Cub Scouts, her mother, so my friend's grandmother, showed me her the brand on her arm from being a survivor of Auschwitz. So growing up in that environment, leading towards a time that some of you may have heard of, but in 1977, the Nazi Party, the long story short on it was they decided they wanted to march in Skokie, and they wanted to march there for the obvious inflammatory aspects of it. The issue went to the U.S. Supreme Court because obviously it's a freedom of speech issue. And basically what wasn't quite the interpretation of the freedom of speech that the Supreme Court ruled on But what they ruled on was that the lower court in Illinois needed to decide that. And they did, and they decided, I believe correctly, freedom of speech, that they could not stop that from happening. And so fortunately, it only went as far as the courts, and they chose not to march in. They wanted to march right down the main part of Skokie, and they chose not to. They instead marched in Chicago. So my parents ended up sending all 5 kids through college. Education, of course, was very important to them, especially because my mom had an opportunity to go back to college and got out of camp after only being in there about 4 or 5 months. My dad was in about 2.5 years, but she was only in 4 or 5 months. I can tell you that University of Illinois doesn't give we all went there, and there's no discount given for volume. I mentioned the Smithsonian exhibit that I went to with my mom. Now to kind of round out this story and move into wrapping it up, the Civil Liberties Act was signed by Ronald Reagan in October of 1988, along with a congressional apology and a decision at that time to give $20,000 in reparation money to those survivors of the concentration camps. By the time it worked its way through the system, George Herbert Walker Bush was the president who signed it. And so what I did was I took a copy of the check that my dad received and put that on top of the picture of the letter that they were sent. And I know that it was a letter that was sent that was framed and mounted on the wall. That's what meant the most to them. And when you think about the many years that had gone by, almost 46 or 47 years by the time all that happened, and all what they lost in that time of basically fire sailing everything they had or giving it away, it was a very significant and meaningful step that was made by the U.S. government at that point in time. Now, more than Japanese Americans were affected, although not to the same extent. And as I mentioned, 120,000 Japanese Americans, but just under 11,000 German Americans and a little over 3,000 Italian Americans were incarcerated in some form. An additional 10,000 Italian Americans were relocated from coastal zones. It's interesting because as I've given this talk in various venues, I had somebody who mentioned to me that, oh yeah, there was a camp not too far, in fact, from where we are in Minneapolis, in one of the small towns in Wisconsin, where they knew that there were camps built there. And they said, in fact, there's a book written about it. So I said, oh, and I wrote the book down and I got it. I read the book, and pretty quickly it became interesting that, you've seen what this story is about, what I've talked about. What was happening in that person's mind was, oh, they knew about these camps because they had them close to them. Well, as I read the book, the title of the book was Stalag, Wisconsin. And it was about the captured German soldiers who were sent to the U.S., they were captured, right? But in this particular area, upper Midwest, there's many people of German heritage. And so some of the security was not all that tight. And there were stories about, they get together with the relatives for dinner and that sort of thing. They needed to stay there, live in the prison camps. But it was an interesting transference that there, in my mind anyway, it's a pretty significant difference for prisoners of war and taking your own U.S. citizens and imprisoning them. It's quite a different thing. So in 2004, it's hard to imagine Congress doing anything unanimously, but they did. They named the anniversary of the day that President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 the National Day of Remembrance. I personally prefer to be optimistic rather than pessimistic, and I have a philosophy that things over time get better. And I wasn't able to find a good illustration of this, so I found an EKG and turned it slightly sideways there. The point here being that over time, we go through ups and downs. It's just the way life is. But over time, if you graft it, it's on an uphill climb. And I believe that. be the case. And so that's kind of my metaphorical way to illustrate this point. This is a picture of my mom with our daughter. My mom was 91 and she lived to be lived long enough to have this picture taken. When you think about what she went through, back of a pickup truck in order to go to college, having to have her papers, all the stuff that she went through. And she lived long enough to see her granddaughter, so 2 generations, go by, and to the point of things getting better. She was there for her graduation from medical school. And ever see that? Why this picture means so much to me and why I believe things get better over time. When my mom passed away, showed you that earlier picture of her and her brother at about the time that she got released to go to college. These are the descendants of her and her brother, who got together, the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, who got together at her celebration of life when she passed away at age 94. I would like to wrap up with something that my dad. I moved to Chicago the latter part of January 1944. The U.S. government gave me $25 in a railroad ticket. I was enriched by the camp experiences, and I'm not bitter towards any person or the country of my birth for having been put through the experiences. I believe honestly that I am a better American for what my family and I endured. No group of Americans should have to be subjected to such treatment. And then he said something that I found later, something he had written that I wish I had read when he was still alive. He said, "It might be looked back upon as an experience or happening in the United States that was a result of our own immaturity as a democracy." I'll read that again. It might be looked back upon as an experience or happening in the United States that was a result of our own immaturity as a democracy. I really think that that is a good way to end this, that there's nothing cast in stone for exactly how a democracy needs to work. And it's a living thing, of course, right? We keep groups like yours continuing to push the envelope and testing different things and questioning things. And I thought my dad's words here really did an incredible job of summing up what they had been through. So with that, I noticed there's one thing in the chat, and I haven't looked at that because I've been focused on talking. So I will open it up and stop sharing the screen to bring everybody back.
Well, John, thank you very much. I'm wondering, do you have some time for dialogue or questions and answers?
I do, absolutely.
Thank you. Then why don't we open it up? I'm sure there are folks who would like to share with you. Yeah, go ahead, Mavis. You're muted.
That was fascinating to me. And I think your father's quote there, immaturity as a democracy is very generous. That's a very, very generous comment. I have a question. Can you account for why your mother was only in for 4.5 months and your father was in for 2.5 years?
Yeah, so some of it I know and some of it I don't know. There were a large number of students that were released to go back to college at that time. both my parents had been doing some work, back in those days, they did many times kind of the JC, the junior college for a couple of years, and then they went on to college. And
Yes.
I know that my dad had gone to junior college for some period of time. What I don't know is if he got far enough in order to qualify for whatever my mom got qualified for. I just don't know that for sure. But there were a number of young people that were released to go for the purposes of going to college. And I don't know, it's a good question, what the requirements were to be released.
Okay, so the young people were released to go to school, but like their parents, they were not released. Is
Right.
that? Uh-huh.
That's correct. And similarly, for those who served in the military, they would go back to the concentration camps to visit their family. And, here they are in uniform and going
Yeah.
into, for lack of a better way to put it, back into jail. And
Yeah.
the
Oh my
irony of going to visit their family while they're serving is just, again, one of those ironies, right?
My goodness. Hmm.
It turns out that West Virginia actually participated in internment. All Japanese diplomats were placed in the Greenbrier. And the Greenbrier is in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. It's a wonderful resort. And so they did treat those folks well, but obviously they could not leave from there.
Interesting. Thank you, Ron. My dad, in his early years, did fairly well in his insurance career, and he and my mom went to a one of those sales incentive type of trips at the Greenbrier, and it was somewhere in the late 50s or early 60s. And so when I think about what you just said, and with them circling back and going there, it's an interesting picture. Thank you for sharing that.
John Bolt has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks for that. Like everybody else has said, I was struck by your comment about your dad's experience trying to buy a house in Chicago. There's a book called The Color of Law, which catalogs a lot of the real estate issues, the redlining that was going on. And as I recall, it's been a little while since I read that book, but as I recall, Chicago was one of the worst offenders of that practice, and the Chicago Board of Realtors, that they were all in cahoots, if you will, to make that happen. So that apparently happened a lot there.
Below the radar screen. Yeah, thank you for that, John. Maria?
Just this last comment when he's talking about the book, The Rule of Law. I'd like to show you, I just got this book in the mail today. It's called Just Action. It's a new book, and it follows up the rule of law. And it's by the same man who wrote The Rule of Law, about the restrictions that the state put on African Americans buying real estate, but it's how to challenge segregation enacted under the color of law. So it's very timely, that last comment.
Just Action.
I'll have to go look for it.
By Rothstein. It's the same man who wrote Rule of Law.
Thank you. Yeah.
Susan?
Yeah, thank you so much, John. Wow, what a powerful story, and how meaningful for you to put it together, not only for your personal knowledge, but just your willingness to share that with us is really very powerful and very meaningful, and I appreciate that. I was really struck by the retribution, the letter of apology, and were you still? How many years after did you say that letter came?
So the things were passed in 1988. The letter was signed by George Herbert Walker, and I think it was in 1990. I could go back and check it, but his term was what, 88 to 92, wasn't it? So it was, yeah, because he served one term. In
But
fact, I could, if you want. go back
40
and-
some years later, yeah,
Right.
40
Right.
some years later. Wow. And how not, your parents have obviously were not very bitter about it all. And that's amazing to see that.
You know, one way that I would characterize it is they didn't wear it on their sleeve, or to use common terms today, they didn't play the card, right? They, when asked, they would talk about it, but they didn't talk about it when they weren't asked. And the way that I would characterize that is we often talk about the greatest generation and all the things that happened during World War II. Typically, it's not directed in this direction, right? It's directed towards all the troops that went, and rightly so, and defended us. But a twist that I would put on this is I think that's another example of the greatest generation. People of their ilk, they just chose not to whine about it. You know, they just put it in a box and tucked it up away, but didn't lock it. And, you know, I don't know, the older you get, the more you realize that it's probably a good way to do it. If you just let your life be centered by all that, you'll never get away from it. So just move on. And so that's probably how I'd characterize what they did.
And let me just add, it makes me also think about, you know, the reparations that they gave, and I just wonder if and when we can come to that in the United States with our, with slavery and the incarceration that we did during that period, colonial period.
Yeah, that, of course, no easy answers on that. The way they chose to deal with this was to literally, the operative word was all living survivors. So who went, right, so the qualifiers went through the experience. And so it very much, from a precedent standpoint, they chose that carefully, obviously. I would share, though, something that years and years ago, I was in an interesting discussion with an African-American man who did work with young African-American youth. And it was a fascinating discussion, and something he said has never left me, and I've spread it as often as I can, because I think it was a great way to put it. He said, what he teaches them is that their ancestors were not slaves, that they were prisoners of war. And the significance of characterizing it that way was slaves is master slave, right? Even in computer language, there's master slave relationship. You always think about that. It's hierarchical. But prisoners of war are equals fighting, and they happen to be captured. But he just tried to put in their heads that you're not less than your relatives were prisoners of war, and that just left an indelible impression. That Aaron.
Yeah, Karen?
John, like everyone, thank you so much. It's such an emotional thing for you, I'm sure, to each time you give this to share. And we just really appreciate it. Both times I've heard you talk, and then I watched it again. You shared a YouTube presentation. I don't want this to sound I don't know. Maybe I'm getting into the political realm too much, and I know you don't want this to be overtly political. But I think it's really amazing what you just shared about the greatest generation and how your parents, you can look at it that way, as just let's move on and not dwell on it. I have a hard time. Of course, it's easy for me to say I'm not one of the victimized people, so it's very easy for me to say, but I just feel like this group certainly would want to, and maybe any thoughts you have, we would want to learn from your talk and the experiences as to what we really can do to help. You know, your dad said he sees this as an immature democracy. Well, you know, we all have to wonder, is our democracy any more mature now than it was at the time your dad said that? And all the ironies you shared and the spin, I thought that the spin, alien versus non-alien, instead of using the word citizen, I just wonder, would we all be savvy enough and educated enough and courageous enough to speak out against that when our government or other groups, you know, use that type of spin to allow things like this to happen again to anyone who's different, whether it be transgender or different, you know, minority peoples, whatever. But I just wonder if you have any thoughts.
Couple of reflections on that. The education part of this is so important, and so it's interesting. I've had a chance to talk to just a lot of people, and ranging in age from probably the youngest would be middle schoolers, and then just throughout just many different types of people and audiences. And frankly, some of the best questions and discussions are from the middle schoolers, because they're just you know how they are, middle schoolers, and so they're just asking. And I should have, you know, I'm usually not writing down things as I'm talking, so I wish I had written them down to remember some of the questions. But I remember just being impressed to no end at some of the questions and the points that came up. So the continuing education of them is of everybody is important, but really at school age. And the other one, you mentioned the YouTube video. So a friend of mine, literally from first grade, went to first grade together, and he teaches constitutional law at Boston University. And he's the one who he asked me to speak for his class, and of course it's during COVID, and so ended up doing it by Zoom. And he asked if I'd be okay recording it, so he did. And he also asked if I'd be okay if he put it on YouTube, so he did. And so that if anyone was wondering, that's what Karen was referring to. But it's also fascinating to know that in constitutional law, that he opened up in his class this opportunity and showed, you know, had me talk to them about this and teed it up with them, so that as they studied the Supreme Court law, Korematsu, that this talk would be kind of in the same timing. And so I think doing things like that is the point. From my perspective, it's, you know, we can all just make hopefully a small difference, and hopefully there's a few people that, you know, you reach through those types of things. And that's I guess that's my hope.
Karen,
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
I want to thank you again. It's more powerful every time I hear it, and I think it's just that it's a personal story, and I think that makes so much difference. And the other thing is, one of the things that Kristen, that's my daughter, Karen kind of asked, and I think some of the examples that you have provided about the people that stepped in and were fair and were nice and did the right thing, and how that's the example. That's how I think each and every one of us, when we get the opportunity, can make a difference.
I think you're right, Rick.
And John, so that again, you're aware of that educational component that Karen just said. As we formed ourselves together several years ago, education of us is one of the objectives of why we get together, and we followed the advice from the author of the book white fragility, that our responsibility is to get ourselves educated, and we very much what you've left for us today is immense education to understand that part of our history. So we certainly do appreciate that very, very much. Are there other questions or comments from the group as we wind down our time together?
Well, I don't know if you have time for this, but it's somewhat relevant, John. Several years ago, I was in Alaska, and I found out that during the war, some of the native people out on the Aleutian Islands were relocated back to the lower peninsula in Alaska because of security threats. And they were put in old fish cannery buildings for housing, and they were cold, and it was a terrible situation. At the same time, in the area, German prisoners of war were brought and housed in very nice situations. And after the war, the Inuits, the native people, went back to the Aleutians, and their where they lived and their businesses had all been looted by the American troops that were stationed there. And I thought, these are American citizens that were treated just like the Japanese, taken from their home and put in situations that were less than fair.
It's interesting, Ray. I had not heard of that. It sounds to me from your description like it's almost like a cousin to that individual who referenced the Stalag, Wisconsin book, who was mixing prisoner of war with our concentration camps. And kind of a big difference.
But at the same time, they had Germans who were prisoners of war, but where the native people from the Aleutians were brought over, they weren't technically prisoners of war, but they were treated much worse.
Mm-hmm. There's significant challenges ahead of us yet, huh?
Every day, exactly.
Yeah, but people like you are inspiring, that you're meeting and talking about it and trying to figure it out and educate. You really are a beacon. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Margaret, I saw your hand. Were you wishing to make a comment?
Just wanted to say thank you, and what an incredible family, and what a legacy your parents left. It's amazing that they had such a one. And so thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Well, as we close, as you know, we meet on the third Monday of the month at 7, Zoom by Zoom. We invite all of you back again next month, where we will have a planning group between now and then to decide what we're going to do, but you have a taste of what we have done, those of you who have been with us for the first time tonight. So you're more than happy to join with us. I see, Ron, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, do you want to mention something about that documentary that's going to be available on Ollie?
Yes. Next week, there will be a class at Ollie starting at 10 o'clock. Registration has been open, Ron. I don't know whether there are seats yet still available. That's why I wasn't going to say anything about it. But yes, we're going to show the documentary Who We Are. a 2-hour documentary about the history of racism in the United States and the consequences of it, and then have a panel discussion with 4 individuals that are really, it's going to be an exciting day for those of you who are signed up and can make it. But that's our next thing. But our next Zoom will be next month at this time. Mavis, did you wanted to jump in?
I did. If folks would like to be on our Google list for dismantling racism, if you would either pass your email on through Karen, I think that's probably how you got here, or if you want to put your email address in the chat, I'll write it down and we'll add you to the group.
Good. Okay. Well,
It's been
thank you
wonderful.
very much.
Folks.
Thank you very much, all, and wish you the best of your remaining evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, John.